Now, it's time for Modern Money Doughnuts with Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond.
Hi, and welcome to our show, Modern Money Doughnuts. My name's Gabrielle Bond. I am an organiser for the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group in Adelaide in South Australia. I'm also a director of Modern Money Lab, working with Stephen Hale and Phil Lawn. Stephen.
How are you, Gabby?
I'm good, thank you. Yes, bright and early here.
That's excellent. Yeah, you can see the sun rising behind me here in South Australia, which is a sure sign that we're talking to somebody in Europe today, when we have to get up with the lark in order to make the session work, both in Europe and in the US. Our guest this week is Randeep Ramesh. Gabby, maybe you'd like to introduce Randeep.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Randeep, and for bearing with our technical issues. Randeep is the chief leader writer for the Guardian newspaper in London. He is the winner of the British Journalism Awards Scoop of the Year and the What the Papers Say Investigation of the Year for his work on parliamentary lobbying scandals. And he also edited the Guardian's Instant History of the Iraq War. Randeep is a trustee of the anti-poverty charity Z2K and is a member of the Guardian Foundation board. From our point of view, if you've ever read anything in the Guardian which has appeared to be influenced by modern monetary theory, there's a very good chance that it was written by Randeep. So what does the job of chief leader writer involve?
Hi, Gabby. The chief leader writer of the paper is basically a person who has to have a discussion with other editorial board members about big issues of the day, and then basically decides what the Guardian would think about it in a sort of corporate sense. And we kind of have to make decisions about, there could be foreign policy, it could be Taiwan, it could be Ukraine, wow. It could be housing.
You have to know about pretty much everything.
I have a shallow knowledge of, but it's a big puddle. And yeah, so we touch upon a lot of subjects, and I've worked on City, on the finance pages of the Guardian. I've worked as a foreign correspondent, and I've worked as a home reporter and investigative reporter. So I've done lots of different jobs, and I think that's probably why I ended up where I am today. It's very interesting. You get to meet a lot of interesting people. Yeah. The pandemic has been a bit challenging, but we don't always get things right. The Guardian, has to make a decision on subjects, and history could turn out very differently to what we thought it might. So,
yeah, I was going to ask about that because I think there's a great reluctance to acknowledge that, that whole thing about, when the facts change, I change my mind. People tend to, because of things that they might have said on the record in the past, be very reluctant, even when the kind of ground is shifting underneath them, to acknowledge that maybe they didn't have it quite right in the first place, and to, without losing face, say, I was wrong and I now believe it's this other conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, that it's hard because, the Guardian has two traditions. One is a left tradition, one is a liberal tradition. And the left tradition emphasizes, as it would do, vested interests within any system. And the liberal tradition tends to see things as, two sides of an argument. And so you kind of have to straddle those two kind of arguments, two ways of viewing the world. And, what I think you can see is that as the dominating paradigm of the way one views whatever subject you choose to view sort of is steadily eroded by facts, by events, then you have to find a different narrative, a different paradigm. And it's quite it can be a struggle. I think, it's often useful to have a disciplining matrix when you're trying to put forward an argument. I mean, these are all sort of, fancy ways of saying people look at the world in a particular way, usually influenced by who they are and what they are. But, that's just what we have to do as a sort of editorial board. But we're not just we're just one voice in a paper. I mean, we are the voice of the newspaper, if you like, but it is one voice these days, as opposed to in the grand old days of the Guardian when it was basically the only voice.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about the view of the newspaper, because particularly where anything to do with modern monetary theory is concerned, I'm often responding to people online because the sort of people that are interested in MMT are very often Guardian readers. When people either complain about something they've read in the Guardian, or they'll be reading something which looks very MMT informed in the Guardian, which you've probably written yourself, and they're saying, "Oh, I didn't know the Guardian was so pro MMT." And I usually respond by saying, "Well, a newspaper doesn't really have one opinion. Instead, it's a conflation of lots of people's opinions. So it just depends on who's written a particular piece."
Yeah, I mean, I would say I mean, I've said this to you before, Stephen, in different formats, that I'm not an economist. I'm a journalist, and I wouldn't even describe myself as a modern monetary theorist. I'm just happen to believe that the Guardian's economic tradition is rooted in a post-Keynesian view, and it should have been. And we have made deviations, which I consider errors from that understanding of the world in economic terms. You might know, like Larry Elliott, who's our economics editor, is a Keynesian. I mean, I don't think he'd mind me saying that. So when people sort of read the stuff that they think is sort of deliberately MMT, I wouldn't say it is. I think it's just the best disciplining matrix, the best way of looking at the world. I mean, I think
that's exactly right. And we need to keep reminding people that MMT is a lens. It's not well, apart from the prescriptive side, which, as I understand it, is about having a job guarantee for people who are involuntary unemployed against their will. It's really just a correct way of viewing how the world really works.
Yeah, I think there are. I suppose I would say that, and again, this is just purely born out of experience. And I think I've said this. Stephen knows this a bit. Is one of the questions that Queen Elizabeth asked a bunch of economists at the LSE in 2008 is, well, why didn't you see it coming? And it was a good question to ask. But the thing was, when I read, I think it's called Money and Government, which is Robert Skidelsky's book on economics, and in the footnotes it says, well, it's interesting to note that there were a group of economists that did see this coming, and if you look in the footnotes, you can see them listed, and they are, let me get this right, there's a gentleman called William Black, I think. There's Randall Wray. There's a series of people, and they all happen to come. Although Robert Skidelsky in that book doesn't say they are MMTers, they all happen to be MMTers. And then the Eurozone crisis, which again, when the ECB started intervening in the secondary markets to reduce bond yields, that was predicted. Well, it's godly le voir, but I mean, it's MMT also. I mean, that's where it draws its tradition from. And then again, overnight interest rates. Well, when you expand your deficits, what happens with overnight interest rates is they head towards zero, which again is one of those kind of empirical proofs of what MMT was suggesting would happen. So, these are. What more can one do when one looks for explanations of what's going on, but sort of say, okay, well, strangely enough, this version of post-Keynesianism seems to be, explaining things that I want explained.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, but that's, if I mention Daniela Gabor or if Daniela Gabor gets mentioned in a leader, or Isabella Weber, or any number of other post-Keynesians, Malcolm Sawyer, these are not they're all of a tradition. I'm not expert enough to know entirely what all the differences are between them, but I think the Guardian simply sort of aligns itself in that.
I think
kind of world.
very few of us, not include. I'm in the same category as you there, Randy. In fact, I was going to ask you. I would describe myself as post-Keynesian, and
Right.
I'm not a leading economist, but there are some people that I would regard as leading economists, like John Harvey, who would also regard themselves as post-Keynesian, but are in the modern monetary theory camp as well. And Randall Wray was a famous post-Keynesian before modern monetary theory even existed as a thing. And yet, everywhere, but especially in the UK, there are a lot of post-Keynesian economists who not only wouldn't regard themselves as being associated with MMT, but who are really quite hostile about that perspective on the world. And I genuinely don't understand why. I don't understand the difference between the groups, really. You speak to these people on both sides of the fence. Is there a difference, and what is it?
It's a good question, because I think I first started really looking at MMT 5 years ago, and I think I struggled to know exactly what the differences were, and I think some of it. I remember talking to an associate of Wynne Godley's, who's around still, and he actually, I think the great worry for the British economy, for people who've dealt with the British, I mean, he was an advisor to Tony Benn, this guy was a part of the Cambridge Group.
Francis Cripps, you must be referring to, I guess.
Yeah. So exactly. So and Francis, I thought, was the most incisive kind of understanding of what MMT was, because he had sort of followed the debates. And I don't want to quote him wrong, because I so had a great respect for him when I talked to him. And I think what his problem was really whether the one could reorientate things. I think he had felt that it had gone too far to easily kind of switch to a real resources model. I mean, if one can put it in those terms. I don't think as someone who had kind of dealt with that world and still deals with those kind of problems, sectorial balance problems on a global basis, I mean, he's well aware. And I thought he had quite a interesting take on it. I mean, subsequent to that, I mean, this is sort of getting a bit technical, but I did think, I was rather convinced by John Harvey's argument, of what determines a currency's level. And that was one of the questions that Cripps had kind of raised, was like, you tinker with these things at your peril, and there has to be some political notion of what you're seeking to achieve. And that's quite hard to do given the prevailing winds in the UK. And I understand that. And it's a very centralized system. And you know this better than I do, Stephen. It's very hard to move against the orthodoxy, which, has been a losing battle for people who are interested in the post-Keynesian or Keynesian side of the argument since about 1949, when the Treasury kind of basically did away with cheap money.
I remember it well.
Yeah, but it seems to be this sort of argument kind of goes back to those sort of days, and I think that's the Treasury's dominance of economic thinking is quite remarkable in this country. It's quite hard to push against that, and it's not a decentralized sort of. The European landmass is bigger, so you have more interesting debates there, I think, sometimes, and they have much more interesting kind of viewpoints. They've been through so many different sort of histories to get where they are. The American is a big country. Developing countries, have their own traditions of viewing things. And certainly my interest in Keynesianism as a sort of idea was through the developing economy model. So, I'd been a leader writer writing about development. That's how I sort of 20 years ago. Anyway, this is a long way of saying that England is very resistant for all sorts of reasons. Some of it is, left-wing economics is dominated by Marxists, I would say.
But the thing that surprises me a little bit is that for me, post-Keynesian economics is first of all the notion that market economies left to their own don't automatically self-correct. They have no tendency to full employment. Secondly, that the distribution of income and wealth has a lot to do with bargaining power and isn't technologically determined or to do with productivity. And thirdly, the old Minskian story that financial capitalism is unstable upwards and naturally has booms and busts and needs to be constrained, all of which, of course, feeds into MMT. But the thing that confuses me a little bit about that, the UK story, which I accept that just the way you've been talking about it, is that after you failed to have any influence consistently for 70 years, you might think that a slightly different approach might not be such a big risk, because as I said, I think of myself as a post-Keynesian, but
it depends what you're trying to achieve, doesn't it?
Well, across much of the world, post-Keynesians are 70 years old or above. That's basically maybe not in the UK, but here, pretty much, unless you're at Sydney University, you're probably 80 something if you're a post-Keynesian. And I like the way John Harvey puts it. He says modern monetary theory is just post-Keynesian monetary economics done right.
Yeah. I mean,
but I know Randeep is we've had some quite long conversations over the phone, so I think we agree.
I was wondering if we could talk about a little bit about the sort of the donut economics side of things, because we try to that's our aim, is to combine MMT with the idea of a more sustainable way of living and a more sustainable economic system. So do you have contact with Kate Rayworth?
Not for a few years. No.
Okay.
I mean, that's because I remember Steve emailed me and I kind of had to think my brains, when's the last time? And it would have been a few years before the pandemic, because I think that book had come as a sort of, quite an important book some years ago, and had picked up a lot of traction, as had Mariana's book. And Kate's had come out, and but it kind of got lost in this way. I mean, not that I don't think it's a great book, and she's not a brilliant economist, but it kind of didn't punch through for me. But that wasn't anything to do with Kate or the work, which is, it's a landmark book. And I think that's one of the, like as Stephen says, I've been much more engaged with, I think, more traditional Keynesians and post-Keynesians. But I think Kate's, the general point, of course, about environmental sustainability, I kind of don't really know how. Well, I do know. I don't really think we're willing to accept in this society the kind of trade-offs, because how many years, how many decades has it been that we have broken the planetary boundary for resource use? I mean, we're way, I don't
50
know,
years now.
50 years, there you go. And, we continue to use materials that can't be replenished, or it's going to be a hell of a job re-extracting them. So I'm not quite sure. And Kate and Jason Hickel, who like all of us, like me, has been on a journey, because I think his first books were much more mainstreamy, and he's become much more radical now. Which is another sort of interesting development for people. But I think it's all on this basis of, once people sort of start seeing that we are actually reaching a tipping point in where we will not be able to return to a position of, say, 10 or 20 years ago. And I think the IPC, what have we got, 10 years, maybe 9? I can't remember what it is, but
8.
it's a very 8.
Yeah.
There you go.
Mm.
It's a very short period of time, because we are, I think, as Kate and Jason sort of say, we're sort of hooked onto this GDP, rising value of transactions idea, which, doesn't capture what it needs to capture. The price signal is not going to be able to do that, and we need a fundamental reappraisal of what human well-being is.
Where do you think that would come from? Does it have to come from people like Extinction Rebellion and people, just ordinary people on the street, realizing that we can't go on as we are?
I mean, Extinction Rebellion is they're an interesting, they're an interesting group. I mean, they're sort of demonized by the press here generally the right-wing press. I mean, it's hard to find who are the left-wing press, but I think they are demonized by many in the sort of popular newspapers because of their tactics. But they're just there to highlight, to wake people up, in essence, out of their slumber from what is happening with the planet. And I mean, it's very easy in Britain because we're at the end of the high value end of a supply chain of goods. We don't really see the degradation that's going on. The nickel mines of Indonesia are far away. I mean, Australia,
the same, but in a smaller way, I suppose.
Yeah.
Although
in some ways, in a bigger way, we're where all the coal comes from.
I guess we're also we have a climate that is really susceptible to droughts and bushfires and devastating flooding and all sorts of things going wrong. But then, having said that, the UK has had a really bad time with that kind of natural disasters as well. So it's everywhere. It's in the US.
I think it's when do you see a crisis? I mean, you don't really see it until it's upon you. I mean, this is a don't look up sort of idea, but I mean, it's true. And what crisis will hit us first? I mean, it's funny, COVID is one of those crises overlaid upon a sort of slower moving, but probably more existential crisis of the environment. So I always like the idea of the pasta price rises, and they partly go back to the droughts in the Canadian wheat growing regions. So not enough wheat being grown. Then COVID comes along, disrupts the supply chain, energy prices go up, and this all feeds through to prices of pasta rising by 70% or whatever it is in the shops. If you get a few of those, then maybe the people will see the crisis. I don't know. They're certainly it's not being explained to them.
Quite a lot of people don't even notice the price of pasta. I should say many, many, many do, and it affects people greatly. And I've been following the Bootstrap Cook on Twitter, and her, that whole sort of thing about affordability. It was a really interesting area. I've also
in Australia.
Sorry,
Gabby, go on.
I was just going to say, I also read quite a lot of George Monbiot, and I think he also is trying to wake people up, and he writes really passionately and movingly about that the kind of desperation of the don't look up thing. And I wonder if we've got time, maybe I noticed him asking questions about MMT recently, and I wonder if he may be thinking about looking at the economy in a different way.
I don't know. I mean, I know George a bit, but I wouldn't say that I kind of talk to him about these things in any great depth. He's his own man. I mean, he's his own person. He makes his own decisions, and but I'm sure he'd be willing to listen. I think the part of the problem with, I mean, it's interesting that you've taken the environmental kind of side of it. May be the way that people can see MMT as a sort of way of viewing the world, and it and it might work for them in that sort of way, in the same way that it worked for me because it explained a few things, that I had been sort of pondering, why is this working in this way? I could have got there. Maybe others would argue I could have got there if I read, Jean-Michel or another post-Keynesian economist. Fair enough. But I think that it may be a really interesting way of getting people to understand the economy if you can get them to understand the sort of environmental crisis. I would say one thing, which I think we can all be upended by these things. And I'm interested to know whether there is a geoengineering solution to the planetary, to climate change. I personally think climate change is a bit bigger than just CO2, because it seems to me we're using a lot 100%. Of resources, and
certainly sustainability is, and that's where I think the genius of the 9 planetary boundaries approach, which is the outside of the outside ring of Rayworth's donut, of course, is concerned. I was going to mention George Monbiot as well. Great minds think alike. Pussy has a home at the Guardian. That's where we read a lot of the things that he writes. But it's been very good to see Kate and Stephanie connecting up, Stephanie Kelton and Mariana as well, and them holding each other's books in that famous photograph.
The Twitter
Jason Hickel has engaged too. With modern monetary theory, and we have a reading on the weekend courses we run, where Jason writes about MMT and job guarantees. I think George Monbiot has said he's MMT curious.
Okay,
which is
well, that's good. I mean, it all begins with that, right? And the impulse to understand something. So I think
and
he'd be a great ally.
To say, maybe I had it wrong before, and I now know better. I wish more people could do that.
We're all learning. I mean, just look at Paul Krugman and Larry Summers. They're learning. They're learning in public. They're being taught in public.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it was great to meet you 4 years ago, Randeep.
That's right, Steve.
It's kind of taken me back to that. We met in Oxford when I was extraordinarily jet lagged and trying to give a talk. And why you've reminded me of that was because although the politician who was speaking is a very impressive person, it was Molly
Cato
Scott,
Smith, wasn't it?
Cato. I originally agreed to do that talk because the other person that was going to be giving the talk was going to be Kate Raworth.
Oh, was it? Wow.
Not that I was at all disappointed, because was great. And we got to meet, you probably met him before numerous times, but we got to meet Larry Sanders as well. That's right. On that occasion, which was marvelous. But maybe you've already answered this question, but you seem to know quite a lot about MMT even then, in 2018. What was your first introduction? I mean, what was the first thing you read, or who was the first person you met?
The first thing it was it was Bill Mitchell's blog.
Excellent.
Which somebody had, and it was about the Eurozone. I mean, I'm agnostic about the ECB. I mean, at that stage, I wasn't kind of I'm not like Bill, who sort of thinks that the Eurozone is a sort of dystopia that's all going to end, and it's so. And maybe I just hadn't engaged with it, although I had my fill of Europe, having worked there as a reporter, and I thought, oh God, I don't want to get out of here. So I think that was my first kind of thing. But it was just another blog that I used to read. There's plenty of them, and I didn't really understand it because it had its own style of explaining things. So I left it to one side. The first person who actually made me think really hard about it was Fidel Caboo, because he gave a talk at City University about the job guarantee. And it was at a time when it was sometime earlier, but the job guarantees had started being talked about at the end of the Gordon Brown premiership in Britain, which was sort of 2009, 2010. And I'd just come back from Asia as a foreign correspondent. And I'd sort of known the New Labour project and was quite surprised to see it end up there. And then it kind of disappeared, although their mini scheme was actually very successful. And I ended up sort of doing a lot of social affairs kind of reporting, and had always wondered about this scheme. And then Fidel sort of popped up. I can't remember when it was, 2017, I think, maybe 2018. Anyway, it was about then, just sort of saying. And then when he explained it, and he's a great sort of, he's very good at sort of explaining things, Fidel, and so I'm slow, so he's very good at dealing with people like me. And I thought, this is really smart. This is great. Why don't I understand economics, even though I sort of think I get Keynes, in the way that he can kind of explain it to me so clearly. And that's really where it started, and when I started reading up on it. And then I had a sort of an idea of doing a sort of bigger piece on post-Keynesianism, and that's where I talked to like Vicky Chick and kind of Francis and other people, Joe, and it was a great time because Corbyn was in the air. So this idea that you could have a different sort of economics was being kind of retailed. Bernie Sanders was sort of big in America.
Yep.
So everything seemed possible. History was to prove otherwise, but I mean, it was an interesting time, and that's where I sort of. But what I really thought was brilliant about opening your mind up was if you were prepared to read a few books again, in some cases for me, and understand them in a different way, you could really grasp at something that you had maybe glanced and kind of not really understood. I don't know if you get that. I mean, for me, that was the way. And I've been much more comfortable now with the post-Keynesian traditions, sort of talking to people about them and understanding why people hold certain views, because they're not ideological in the sense that there's some great kind of left-right ideology. They just have a belief system, and you have to sort of accept that belief system.
Yeah, or they've been taught a certain way, and they need to kind of unlearn things. Yeah.
For me, I agree with what you were just saying, Randy. Sorry, please continue.
No, I'm just rambling. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I was going to say that for me, the great thing about MMT, and Bill Mitchell would not agree, I don't think, because I think Bill sees MMT as having far fewer roots in post-Keynesian economics than I do. And he's the great expert, and I'm not. But for me,
fair enough.
The thing about post-Keynesian economics was it was almost, at least when I encountered it, almost the economics of defeatism. It's what's wrong with the way the world is being run at the moment, and what will remain wrong because nobody's ever going to listen to us. That was what it sounded like to me, whereas the modern monetary theory perspective was more positive. We don't always have to lose. We actually have, here is a proposal, but here is a really transformative way of looking at the world and looking at public finances, which can change people's opinions and can make things look possible, which previously didn't look possible. But I think, and maybe Gabby will have another question, otherwise we'll have to wind up soon, but I think there's a much smaller step from post-Keynesian economics to modern monetary theory than the vituperative dialogue that you sometimes see would make it appear. I think we're very close cousins, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Bill is, he's a very, very clever guy and knows much more about, economics than I would ever be able to. And
me too, 100 times as much as I do.
And I'm sure he can see these differences, and he's probably being engaged in debates where he has been debating those differences, but they are too fine a point, or I am not. I don't have that in me to see that fine detail. Some of it may not be fine detail, But I think it's, his books are always, they're very interesting. They're very informative. They've got, and I kind of hold him in quite high regard. I know it's a sort of, I'm sure he thinks the Guardian is, Remainer Central or whatever, but that's fine.
Well, he played the same role in my education that he played in yours, Randy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem is really that how without a political project does one sort of change the paradigm, and because I think the academy is up for change, and it's in its nature to want to have a debate. I mean that must meet the challenge, but essentially economics is a political project. I mean, that's what I sort of think is bizarre. And this week it'll be I can't remember, 38 years since Nigel Lawson gave the Mays lecture, which reset, changed the growth and employment, macro micro view for the British Treasury, or at least for him. The arguments about the Phillips curve, everything sort of, these are pivotal moments. And it's a politically driven project. And it was about, financializing the UK economy, which, has been successful in many ways. I mean, it's successful for the people who pursue that project. But it's left us in
many other people.
But I often wonder whether Germany's experimenting with a huge current account surplus and wage repression is not the flip side of something similar, like a politics which has, been captured by the thing it sought to reinvent its own economy with, as sort of parasitically, put itself into the system. And Schwarzenegger and all that stuff is, well, of course you would. I mean, you've got 8% GDP, current account surplus. Well, what exactly are you going to do with a fiscal deficit? It's sort of it's just another way of viewing where their politics gets them. And that for me is a great problem. Like I wonder whether Green Party, which had a more took you back to real resource constraint, because I think that's what green politics must end up in. I mean, it can try to go through all different ideas, but it will end up there unless there's a solution in geoengineering or something like that, which that can turn them into some sort of techno green movement. But I think they'll end up in this kind of space, which is much more about real resources, and that's a sort of Keynesian 4-day week place.
That's a great place.
People can see the benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to bring the discussion to a conclusion, since we're well over our normal time, even with the late start.
No, very true, very true. I think that's something to hope for, isn't it? That we can learn to value things differently and think about work differently, and
I mean,
within our planetary boundaries.
Unless there's some silver bullet that I'm missing. I mean, this is kind of, it's part of the things that somebody like me has to think about, because I can be, if you make these arguments, then one has to worry that they may all just be wrong. You just may have you may have missed the speeding train that's going straight past you, but anyway.
Well, that was so really fascinating,
Randeep.
Yeah, thanks.
It's so good to talk to you.
Thanks.
I learned quite a lot about the economic side of MMT and how it emerged and what its relationship is to post-Keynesianism. So thank you for that, and thanks for coming on with us.
Stephen's been a great person that I ring up. He's a teacher, in actual fact, of mine. I watch his stuff, so I'm
always feel free to reach out. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
do.
definitely.
I tell him to come back home. We need some sort of some professor to
Well,
take up.
he may be coming for a visit.
Oh well, no, I'll
Yeah.
see
Fingers
him then.
crossed.
I've told him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll get him lunch.
Yeah, in July. That'd be great. Thanks
Yeah.
very much, Randeep.
No
And
problem.
Thanks, Randy.
I should also just remind people that next week we're going to talk to Sherry Wise again,
Yes.
this time
Yes.
about climate change, which will be terrific, and about Joe Firestone's show that follows us on a Tuesday evening in New York.
MMT Tuesdays.
Wednesday morning
Yes.
in Australia.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much. I'll
Take
play
care.
the
Thanks, Randeep.
video.
Thank you so
No
much.
problem, Steve. Anytime.